He knew he had nothing to complain about and was grateful for his life and family. But in the back of his mind, he was always craving more. He didn't like his nose because it was larger than the average nose and stood out from his face at such a sharp angle. He despised his flushed cheeks, which always made him feel inadequate and disfigured his otherwise fair face. He hated how he spoke without thinking and how he was certain to spoil every conversation by saying something totally inappropriate. He developed a major inferiority complex as a result of all of these reasons, which made it obvious that his romantic aspirations were doomed before the butterflies in his stomach even started to bloom. His success over the years did not improve matters, and he eventually began to think that his life was cursed. While working in a dull office selling cleaning supplies, a coworker once thought it would be a good idea to light up a cigarette indoors. However, she realized she couldn't toss the finished cancer stick in her own trash, lest she be detected. She decided to throw it in Martin's garbage bin as a result. Martin reasoned that it would be forgiven if she had bothered to stub out the cigarette in the first place. The crumpled bits of paper made the perfect fuel as the fire blazed. Fortunately, a separate colleague noticed the fire and quickly doused it before it could do any severe damage. Nobody was hurt. In spite of Martin's protests that he had never smoked a day in his life, he was called to his superior's office that day and fired immediately away for many safety and health code breaches. Following the loss of his work, Martin lived in apparent poverty for a few years. He had a roof over his head, but little food in the refrigerator and an old mattress for a bed. While quietly angry at how chance had turned his life upside down, he kept complaining about how unfortunate he was as he lay on his mattress with a spring pricking his hip. Martin Quinn hated all of these things about himself. He could see, though, that not all was dismal. Despite his dismal love life and his financial struggles, he had a number of close friends who he cared deeply about. He understood that because he was always there for them, and they were always there for him, he was never truly alone. His family had always been there for him, even though he was aware that it would be much easier to just leave him on the street and let him fend for himself. He recalled the incident when he smashed his mother's beloved glass, which she had treasured since she was a young girl. When he tripped, a glass that was older than Martin, and possibly just as priceless to his mother, collapsed, taking the priceless object down with him. When opposed to the tears streaming down his rosy cheeks as he worried about the punishment he would receive for gravely injuring his mother, the blood trickling down his wrist from a terrible cut he had on his hand was nothing. His mother witnessed him whimpering and desperately gripping at his lacerated hand as she attended to his wounds, but despite the fact that it was evident that it was her cherished glass that smashed into a million pieces and would never be used again, she didn't even mention the glass as she treated his wounds. She would no longer be able to handle the glass the same way she had when she was his age, and Martin could tell that mother was crying because he had hurt himself rather than because he had been irresponsible. Martin always remembered that specific event clearly, and it fostered a constant sense of duty and loyalty toward his mother. Even as she lay in that hospital bed, her mind and body slowly deteriorating due to the brain cancer, he was there every day without fail to take care of her. Because cancer was frighteningly common in his family, he never considered the tragedy to be the consequence of bad luck. He regretted having even entertained the possibility, but he felt incredibly fortunate not to have caved in already. He made sure his mother had the best medical attention after landing a profitable job with an international business that engaged in all kinds of commerce, whether it was legal or criminal. Martin's morals had slightly eroded over the course of the 10 years since the terrible cigarette event, and he was now prepared to accept his substantial paycheck in exchange for keeping silent about the questionable trading that took place every day. His mother appeared to accept his deception that he worked at a bank, but he never gave her the real explanation for how the money got to be there. When she finally succumbed to her illness, he was there at her side with the rest of his family, holding her hand and reminding her of his love throughout their brief time together. She passed away with a faint grin on her face, and Martin felt happy that he had been able to repay all the kindness and love she had showed him despite his excruciating anguish. Martin realized he had led a happy life as he looked back, despite all the challenges and successes, the highs and lows of his calm life. He was content in every way. These thoughts flitted across his mind as the plane accelerated toward the ground. Martin did not plan to board that specific flight. Martin had not given it much thought at the time because it was common for people to develop a spine or grow a brain and decline these tasks. Therefore, he could not hold his supervisor accountable for giving him the responsibility of seeing it through. However, he was forced to take on the task himself after receiving a last-minute call from a woman who had been diagnosed with a severe case of drinking way too much and regretting it the next morning. They would only lose a significant bank account because everyone entered into a non-disclosure agreement. The fact that he had been promised a substantial check and would only have to stay away from home for one night before being sent back the next day helped. He only needed to go to a particular warehouse, give a certain man a certain briefcase full of certain typical goods that would clear customs, and then set out for home. Without thinking, he readily agreed. Having delayed saying no, he now regretted it. Without incident, he breezed past the standard airport security and baggage inspections. As he waited at the terminal, dozing intermittently, a man screaming bloody murder shook him out of his reverie. He was wearing a tattered green jacket with various red, brown, and black stains. He was lanky and tall. The man's eyes were bloodshot and blurry, and from the few meters that separated Martin and him, he smelled like a skunk that had bathed in sludge and then puked up a supper made entirely of garlic and onions. His hair appeared to have never been washed because it was matted, oily, and dirty. The lower portion of his face was covered by a thick, bushy beard. The man rushed past Martin, and Martin saw that although sprinting faster than he had ever imagined possible for a human, the man didn't seem to be panting at all. He surged forward, trying to get through the gates quickly and board the plane. Martin had thought that while the plan was great, the execution was terrible. The maniac was tackled to the ground by another passenger who Martin had briefly chatted with as they went through the final round of security checks. The passenger jumped out of his seat and threw his arms around the madman's waist. Several personnel in full security suits were already pursuing the untidy man. The passenger restrained the man to the ground while he screamed and moaned like an animal being cornered and appeared anxious to board the aircraft. Martin noticed that as the security personnel approached them, the crazed man abruptly became fairly calm and collected. The crazed man then spat on the passenger's face as he stared with a hint of discomfort. He recoiled in disgust and horror, but the troops rushed in and tackled the insane man to the ground. Surprisingly, he made no attempt to break free of their grip despite his initially insane and unpredictable actions. When a different guard inquired about the Good Samaritan's well-being and his identity, Martin saw the Good Samaritan's eyes momentarily glaze over. He then gave the guard a pleasant grin and dabbed his spittle with a tissue before blinking once more. Martin said that the man introduced himself as Ron. Before being hauled up, shackled, and taken away, the security team surrounding the deranged man apologized to the other concerned passengers in the terminal and told them that the situation was under control. Martin scowled as he stared at the insane man, wondering why he had given up so easily when it had seemed like his crazed dash to the airport was both deliberate and urgent. In addition, he was frightened by the stains on his jacket, which gave him the impression that every bodily fluid and disgusting liquid had found its way onto him. Without a doubt, that is what caused the smell. The man's grin had crept across his face, sticking out even more from under his bushy, dirty beard. Because of his cooperation in allowing himself to be taken by the security team, Martin received the impression that the man had been hoping to get caught. Martin was eager to board the aircraft, despite the woman at the desk's assurances that nothing had been tampered with on the aircraft as a result of this occurrence. He was about to phone his manager and ask for a new flight time when Ron approached him. "How are you doing, dude?" Ron asked with a gorgeous smile and a Texan accent. "Despite what you may think, I'm not sincere." Martin responded with a shaky but polite smile. "I mean, that nutjob kind of made me uneasy. Tell me, please, I don't know how I had the guts to confront that odorous person. Martin smiled in response, glad to be speaking somewhat normally after being screwed up for so long. His smile returned the next instant, and he continued the conversation. But Martin noticed a flicker behind Ron's eyes, as if he were genuinely examining Martin, right down to his innermost essence. "So, I take it that you're a little eager to get on the plane right now." "You completely hit the mark. I've always had bad luck, you know. It seems I ought to avoid that dude." When Ron's turn came, he snorted while keeping his eyes closed, and his laugh shook his entire body. It was a chuckle Martin had never heard before, and he strongly suspected it may have been a little forced. He might simply be attempting to cheer me up. Martin considered the predicament. Ron stops laughing and gets to his feet before giving Martin a pat on the back and grinning once again. "I wouldn't be concerned about that person, okay?" The passengers on the flight assure him that everything is fine, as he is off to be detained in an unknown location. "You're afraid of flying, right?" Martin responded pitifully, feeling a little intimidated by the man who had the bravery to stop the nutcase, yet still felt at ease boarding the plane. "Never at all. I guess I'm just too careful, my man. Exercising caution pays off. But do you agree that this is one occasion when you can let your guard down?" Martin hoped that by nodding and saying, "You're right," he would feel a little more confident. Before Martin could respond, Ron laughed and moved toward the walkway of the aircraft. "Martin, hurry up. We need to get moving immediately." He caught up to Ron and continued the light conversation as they came closer to the jet. Meanwhile, a small voice in the back of his skull murmured, "I'm sure he knows my name in some way." Martin gasped as he once more awoke from slumber. He moaned softly since he was too weak to even speak. Martin kept doing this, hoping the plane would stop falling soon. His chest was visible as he looked down and noticed all the dark red blood gushing from the cut. Even if the plane crash hadn't happened, he would have died from blood loss. Martin wished for quickness. Faster than cancer, at least. A pool of blackness quickly developed in his field of vision and slowly engulfed all light as his vision started to flicker. He knew he was going to pass out again, or die. As he vanished into the night, his mind went to the unexpected events that resulted in his untimely death. Turbulence was prevalent all the time. The plane impacted with unstable pockets of air more frequently than people getting up to vomit in the facilities. The stewardesses were all pale with straight lips and tightly anchored to their chairs. Martin wasn't really optimistic about it. He observed everyone's worried expressions, mothers consoling their frightened children that everything would be all right, and businessmen dressed identically to himself who were grasping the armrests of their chairs in an effort to calm themselves. Martin felt the same way. He had never had trouble flying, but he was more terrified of the way the plane shook with each turbulence wave that passed. He was looking at the other passengers when he saw Ron. Martin was seated in the rose window seat, 5 rows ahead of him on the aisle seat. When they got to their seats, Martin and Ron separated ways. Ron had been quiet the entire trip. Ron chose to say something cryptic like, "Enjoy the flight," whereas Martin just nodded goodbye. When Martin felt his stomach heave, he knew right away that he was another victim of the turbulence that was trying to break the plane in half. He took a deep breath to keep from creating a mess and throwing up too quickly as he stood on shaky legs. He gripped the couple seated next to him so fiercely that his knuckles became white. Martin took a moment to be thankful that he was alone. He could not bear to witness someone close to him experiencing such terror. Fortunately, Martin entered the restroom without seeing anyone waiting outside. He sighed feebly and thanked his lucky stars that he had been saved this time. As soon as he reached the bathroom, he tossed into the metal toilet, taking care not to touch the bowl and skipping the effort to lock the door behind him. Though he appeared to have vomited his last 3 meals, he had lost track of how long he had been doing so and was still terribly ill. He squinted through tearful eyes and hastily washed his face with cold water. While examining himself in the dirty mirror, he took several deep breaths to slow his heartbeat. "Dumbass, everything will be ok. The jet will soon touch down. so you can relax for a while." He gave his cheeks a couple of light taps, which made them redder, but he didn't mind. "I'm not trying to strike up a conversation with any of the women on this flight." When Martin heard a scream, he turned to leave the restroom. It was a sincere cry rather than a panicked yell at further turbulence. Primal. It was a scream of pure terror rushing to the door. Martin closed it completely and locked it. Although it seemed to like the flight choice more than anything else, his brain went into full fight or flight mode. Ironic given the circumstances, as soon as he curled himself into a ball with his back leaning against the door for support, a torrent of cries reverberated from outside, all of which conjured up bone-chilling horror and varying in pitch and volume. It was possible to hear slicing and thudding, and the shouts grew gradually softer until there was silence. Martin sobbed. Warm tears began to stream down his cheeks as he battled to control his breathing. He wasn't illiterate. He understood what had happened outdoors. He was crying because he knew that whatever it was, it would soon come for him. Martin somehow found the strength to stand. He quickly reasoned that he would die on this plane, either at the hands of a horrific beast or for some other reason, because of his rational character. He was only interested in learning what had murdered everyone so efficiently and promptly. He was desperate to confront his killer. He exhaled deeply for the last time, prepared himself, unlocked the door, and went outside into the mayhem. The cottage was littered with several human parts, and the walls were painted a blood-red color. He saw the young couple he had been seated next to. The man's death was quite painless because to a hole the size of a rubber ball that was precisely drilled through his forehead and left him still seated in his chair with his seatbelt on. Unfortunately, things had not gone well for his lover. She managed to get up from her seat and make her way into the aisle, where her torso lay motionless and legless. Martin couldn't make out any of her missing limbs. There were too many to distinguish any of them. Martin dry heaved against the bathroom door, his stomach churning once more, and despised his stupid brain for putting him through this nightmare. When he was finished, he straightened himself up and saw a man standing in the center of the aisle, approximately 20 feet from where he was, with legs that shook like trees in a breeze. His veins and lips were the darkest black, and although he smiled endearingly and talked with his distinctive Texas drawl, his voice had the undertone of a deeper, much more menacing voice. "You know it was difficult to exercise restraint. I couldn't stop myself." Martin was on the edge of mumbling because his vomiting binge had made his throat so dry. It was the most terrifying thing Martin had ever heard. "I was gonna wait until the plane landed to kill everyone and take you, but I just couldn't stop myself." He chuckled again, the same methodical forced amusement, but with that sinister voice lurking just on the edges. It was the most terrifying thing Martin had ever heard. "Who are you in the world?" "I'm Ron." "No, you're not by any means. You're a demon, man." Indicated, guilty. "But I'm still Ron and a monster at the same time." "What you're talking about? I have no idea," Martin cried as he unsuccessfully attempted to shield the child he had seen being held in his mother's arms from his eyes. On both sides, his arms had been torn from him, and not in a tidy way either. He was reduced to nothing more than two pointed stubs near his shoulders when he met Martin's eyes, which were glossed over. He sighed. "I rarely take over someone who is kind to me, so I'll return the favor by being kind to you. I'll describe who I am to you. You know what? When we got on the plane, you were extremely pleasant to me." When Ron determined that the necessary amount of time had elapsed, he began speaking once more. Martin stayed mute as he awaited Ron or whatever this thing was to go on. "I'm some kind of force. Can you still feel gravity? I resemble that a lot. You might probably come up with a few words that appropriately describe me, even though I doubt there is a word in your language that does so." Martin fought to keep his eyes on the man claiming to be Ron, but the majority of his body was covered in black veins and lips, which really repulsed him. He chose to concentrate on the thing's knees, since they were the part of its body least coated with human viscera. "I remember waking up about 2 weeks ago. I was simply a shadow, flickering about, without a purpose, but I soon came across my first person. Marie is a delightful young child. She had spent the entire day laughing, running, and sweating while playing with her brother in the garden. Martin wondered how Ron managed to keep upright on such shaky legs as he shuddered helplessly at the twisted grin that covered his ebony lips. The sweat drew my attention, Ron continued. Without knowing why, I started to move in her direction before I even recognized what I was doing. And before I knew it, I was there. Ron closed his eyes and relaxedly smirked, seemingly reliving his favorite memory. So you're able to control people, right? Martin's voice was dry, his jaws shaking, and he spoke in a weak whisper. I'm not sure why it works, but that must be a trait of humans, right? Having little knowledge of anything. Ron tilted his head and glared haughtily at Martin. You're just a creature that flips between bodies with no concern for human lives. Martin yelled, amazed he could still speak in such a terrible situation. Behind those red-rimmed eyes of his, he seemed joyful, and when Ron stopped, Martin noticed how bloodshot his eyes were and how there was a gloss to it he had never seen before. I only have a body when I own it, Martin, my love. Ron made a frightful stride forward, and Martin immediately took a step back out of instinct, out of terror for what it was going to do to him. Why was he being protected? One corpse to the next. I gained command of hundreds. I am them, and they are me. Even further progress in the correct direction. After taking a shuddering breath, Martin took another step backward when he heard the sound of his boot hitting on some bloody debris that was scattered about the ground. He fought the urge to puke off. So who was that insane dude before we got on the plane? Was it not also you? Martin, you're a smarty-pants. I like that. I was, and still am, that crazy man, as you put it. It's evident that was merely a performance. I had to find a way to get on this plane, so I decided to sacrifice him. Similar to chess, I suppose. Make a pawn sacrifice so the king can live. Ron tackled you, and you spat on him. I tell you, as a result, I took control of him as well. Once more true. But I didn't notice the man's or Ron's black lips and veins while you had them possessed. After laughing rough and exhaling deeply, Ron lowered his head to the ground. When he next saw Martin's eyes, they were once more a regular human shade. Martin, I appreciate you going into the bathroom, because, the whole flight, I was aching to get my hands dirty. Staying under the radar involves some work. These people would have perished regardless. No matter what he did, that beast would never have spared them. Martin thought for a while, then buried it in the depths of his memory. No one even knows you exist, which explains why you haven't been found yet. Again, accurate. Martin, I realize I misjudged you. You really are rather smart. However, it's good. You'll prove to be really beneficial. How on earth did you come by my name? I've kept it from you. Ron had previously heard the same unnatural laughter outside of the aircraft. It sounded much more exotic now. Martin, you are the most important component I have ever seen. That's the second question of my being that hasn't been answered. When I look at someone, I can see every little aspect about them. Although it is hard to separate the information from the people I see, my eyes can always differentiate the most crucial details. Why me? Why am I so special when I'm just a nobody? Nothing. Martin, you are not at all exceptional. Like you said, you are a nobody. I'm aware of all your flaws, all the things you love and hate about yourself, yet they matter nothing to me. You are a man who is completely ordinary in every manner. However, despite this, everyone has vital roles to play and tasks to finish. Ron took a pause in their conversation, and Martin frowned and turned to look behind him. The cockpit was just a few steps behind him. He can chase after it or shut himself inside. He had a limited amount of time to acquire a weapon, but he was unaware of how little it was. He would have to take immediate and decisive action. He had only this moment to turn things around. Martin recognized he wasn't a hero. He screamed at his legs to move, but all his attempts, they stayed still. He turned back to Ron and proceeded while he grieved at his reticence. You obviously didn't do your homework, because I saw your destination as soon as you landed. A certain individual was met and given a lot of items at an unmarked warehouse. Do what? Martin trembled. The man you're meeting. Well, let's just say he holds a very important position in a particular government. I find it surprising that he is traveling by himself rather than sending one of his lackeys, but I suppose that if you want a job done well, you have to do it yourself. However, that will be his downfall. Martin, that's where you step in. Martin's suddenly wide-open eyes filled with tears as he recognized what had been happening, and he only needed Ron's malicious smirk to know he was right. No, please, Martin murmured. Martin, I apologize profusely. I feel bad every time I take someone else's body. You can believe that I'm only trying to take the bare minimum. Most likely, you were simply unlucky to be chosen as one of the individuals I must exert influence on. Martin merely had to hear that for his legs to begin to move once more. Without speaking, he pivoted and sprinted for the cockpit, throwing the door shut and locking it as what appeared to be a blade pierced the door just inches from his stomach. He took a quick look at the two pilots' dismembered remains before sprinting out of the door. Only the autopilot must have been turned on before they succumbed to their wounds. Martin and the rest of the crew spent some time lamenting for them. He would see to it that their deaths weren't in vain. The sound of Ron chuckling behind the door and the playful way he would drive a sword through it made him flinch as he thoroughly searched the cockpit. When Martin looked more closely, he could see that they were nothing more than simple shadows, similar to Ron's original blade-like form. It's safe to say that's what he used to massacre everyone on board, because he could sense the haughty attitude Ron carried, as if he already knew its success was guaranteed, and because it gave him hope that he may be able to stop. Martin was concerned by the carelessly Ron poked each shadow. Martin didn't let that stop him from searching for weapons of all kinds. Then, by pure accident, Martin noticed it when he peered beneath the co-pilot's seat. The pistol. He didn't expect to see a gun on a plane. Therefore, he was perplexed as to why it was there. However, it's probable that it was positioned there to offer defense against any potential hostile threats. Martin reasoned that it would also work against a demonic entity made of shadows in addition to the terrorist, that the pilots would have likely used it to combat. In order to make sure the rifle was fully loaded, he dove for it and prodded the chamber open. Although his father had occasionally taken him to a shooting range as a child, he had no prior experience with weapons. He didn't particularly enjoy those sessions, but he was grateful for them now. Simply being able to save his life would have sufficed. He stood and turned to face the door, 6 shadows piercing it at once, tearing it from its hinges. In the midst of a cloud of pitch-black shadows, Ron was lifted in the air. His lips were darker than before, and so were his veins. Martin automatically raised the weapon to his chest. Although it seemed as though the entity controlling Ron's body wasn't used to conversing without the company of his human hosts, it sounded ominous enough to cause Martin to almost completely freeze. Ron's Texan accent was completely gone now, replaced with the deepest, spookiest voice he had ever heard. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Martin. However, Martin was not going to permit this to happen in accordance with his evil plan. This thing was now close to passing away. Martin tensed as he continued to aim his gun squarely at the target's chest. He took a long breath, then shot. The way the bullet landed on its intended target with such accuracy would have thrilled his father. Ron jumped back as black blood started to pour from the wound Martin had created. Martin wished to cheer. He had finished it. That terrible thing wasn't him. He may even have stopped the end of the world. He was a true hero. He was. Ron laughed. Martin's smirk changed into a terrified gawp as he watched the huge wound in Ron's chest completely shut and mend. Ron appeared to take great pleasure in Martin's increasing fear as he stared him in the eyes. Good job, Martin. You won't be able to catch me that quickly, though, unless you have about 20 guys shooting at the same exact location. In addition, I still have control over all of my other victims. I'm sorry, Martin, but you just aren't succeeding. Since he had witnessed his mother die, it had been his biggest dread, and he had resolved then that he too would pass away peacefully, surrounded by his loved ones. But it was evident that wouldn't happen right now. Martin felt numb all throughout his body. Martin would disprove this monster if he could even slightly thwart its plan. He'd prevail. As terrified as Martin was of dying, he was less excited by the prospect of being possessed by a demonic force and possibly being to blame for the extinction of humanity or whatever else it might be plotting by seizing control of the government, as it seemed to imply. Without pausing, Martin pointed the gun at the windscreen of the aircraft and fired as quickly as his body would allow. He braced himself against the control panel in the space between the pilots' chairs and watched their bodies fling out into the icy, forgiving air outside through the shattered glass as he quickly dove, because he could feel the air pressure in the cockpit becoming unstable and the plane's angle as it started to descend towards the ground. Martin watched everything in slow motion, watching as it passed him with its face twisted into a vile grin. Due to the success of his strategy, Martin nearly breathed with relief. The blade then pierced his chest, which he felt. Ron shouted a loud, brutish, primal roar that was simultaneously high and low-pitched, angry, terrified, and melancholy. In a fit of rage, Martin clenched the shadow sword and struggled mightily to remove it from his chest. Martin responded before he lost too much blood because he sensed its bulk and how it had a bodily character. He picked up the handgun that had fallen next to him and shot through the shadow with one more shot. Ron coughed up blood and gagged as he watched Martin use his shadow to stay in the aircraft, although nearly hanging out of the cockpit. Blood freely poured from Martin's chest as the remaining portion of the shadow, which was still buried in his chest, disintegrated in the absence of a body to which it might be linked. Although he did his utmost to plug it, it continued to dribble ruthlessly through his fingers, and he berated himself for failing to stop it. Ron was abruptly thrown off the aircraft, shrieking venomously as he did, and the screech grew. Martin gazed back on his life as the jet dropped towards the earth, and as his eyesight blurred, he began to lose consciousness. In spite of being in tremendous pain, having blood all over his shirt and jeans, and being unable to move, Martin's mind was still active, and as he reflected on his final moments of combat with the demon, he had a terrible memory come to mind. It brought back thoughts of how rapidly that thing had healed its wounds and how it boasted about the strength of its healing factor. The black fluid that went through that thing's entire body painted Ron's lips and veins an ugly inky color. Spit gave the beast entry to its first victim. Sweat gave it access to Ron, and through fluids it could inhabit anyone. Like blood. Martin cried out as the jet plummeted to the ground and caught fire. Martin opened his eyes after taking a long breath. He did his best to rise up amidst the flaming wreckage of the jet and extended his body to bear the bizarre static sensation that spread to his arms, fingers, feet, and toes as he gradually regained sensation throughout his entire body. The majority of the plane's impact had been on a few trees, and they were all on fire. It was obvious that the fire would spread, and it would require a significant amount of work to repair the damage. Martin would be long gone by then. He turned to look at the expanse of green grass in front of him, the crackle of the blazing fire around him filling his ears and making him wince at the unpleasant sounds it created. Even if it survived the fall, which was unlikely, there was no way to find Ron's body, and even if there were, finding food and a place to stay would be too difficult. His black lips curved into a smile as Martin emerged from the ruins and took a quick glimpse toward the metropolis that lay only a few kilometers away.